If you have a Bible and find it helpful, please turn in it to Deuteronomy chapter 8. This is where we'll be today. I wish I had written this myself. It's a great saying and something that helps me as I move through this world. The saying is this: if one fights with their conscience and loses, they have won. And I think that's exactly right. That when we find ourselves pricked in conscience in some way and we lose the battle to defy our conscience, we've won the battle. Because that means that God, who is speaking to us through our consciences, has given us sufficient impetus that we would say no to something or yes to something that God would have us say no or yes to. And we live in a world where our hearts and minds are tugged at constantly. I mean, I've waking up in the middle of the night and finding myself drifting into all kinds of thoughts that are not good ones. Awake and thinking to myself, Lord, is there any way that I could think about something different here? So thank the Lord for the cross and the fact that when I can't think of something different, that Jesus has covered that. But how do we structure our lives in a way in which we can live in a more godly fashion, think in a more godly fashion in every way? That's what I'd like to look at today as we look at this particular text. So I'll begin reading in chapter 8, verse 11, if you want to follow along. Be sure you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, ordinances, and statutes that I am giving to you today. This is Moses speaking. When you eat your fill, when you build and occupy good houses, when your cattle and flocks increase, when you have plenty of silver and gold, when you have an abundance of everything, be sure that you do not feel yourself to be self-important and forget the Lord your God, who brought you from the land of Egypt, the place of slavery, who brought you through the great and fearful desert of venomous serpents and scorpions, an arid place with no water. He made water flow from a flint rock and fed you in the desert with manna, which your ancestors had never before known, so that he might, by humbling you, test you and eventually bring good to you. So be careful not to say, by my own ability I have gotten this wealth. You've got to remember the Lord your God, for he's the one who gives you the ability to get wealth. If you do this, he will confirm his covenant that he made by his oath to your ancestors, even as he has confirmed it to this day. But if you forget the Lord your God and follow other gods, worshiping and prostrating yourselves before them, I testify to you this day that you will be annihilated. Just like the nations the Lord is about to destroy from your sight, so he will do to you because you would not obey him. Now this is a harsh text, and I suppose it would be easy to come about doing a very harsh sermon on the basis of this text. But I'd rather not do that. And the reason is, I think most of us know. As Jerry Clower used to say, we know when we're messing up. We know it. I mean, we don't really have to search our minds in some deep way. And in this text, you're looking at the Jews as they've come to the end of their 38 to 40 year wandering in the wilderness. They're at the cusp of entering the promised land. And so Moses stops and he takes a couple of chapters in Deuteronomy to remind them of the things that they need to remember as they move into the promised land. The lesson that God is going to care for you as you move into this land is being reinforced. Now, the reason for this is, and this is important, most of these people that Moses is speaking to were not in Egypt. Those people are gone. I mean, there are a few, I'm sure, elderly, very elderly. Caleb and Joshua are two that probably had some time in Egypt, as did Moses, but most of them have gone. Aaron, he may still be with us, I guess. I don't know who all's there, but most of this crowd don't know anything about Egypt except by the stories they've heard their parents and grandparents tell. And so they need to be reminded. Now, Moses is going to talk to them about the land. It's a good land. They're coming into a land where their needs are going to be met. As a matter of fact, I did a little research on archaeology in this region of the world regarding wealth. How could they generate wealth? The Levant, that little strip of land, there's a reason it gets fought over. The reason is it's full of resources. Full of resources. Solomon's, you know where most of Solomon's wealth came was through copper mining. There's a lot of copper mining that goes on in this region of the world. So it's a good land. And Moses reminds the people of all the things they've come through in the desert. There were people groups that they found resisting them as they wandered. And God brought them through that. So they're reminded here to be strengthened as they go out. Now, I tell you, that is a modern feature of human nature, in my mind, that we still have here with us today. I can't speak for anybody else in this room, but I can say this honestly for myself. In my life as a Christian, it's never been a chore for me to show up for church. And the reason for that is I feel a need for it. I feel a need to be reminded so that when I go back into the week where I don't have that reminder, I'm going to have something I can carry with me through the week to give me strength. Well, that's what Moses is doing here. This is like a church service in a way. He is getting them ready to go into this promised land. And he's doing three things. There are three goals with this that I could think of. You could probably think of more. But there are three I'd like to look at today. One is teaching, another is tempering, and another is remembering. He is teaching them. Why the journey? You know why? Did you know, if you take a map and you look at that journey that they spent 38 years, roughly 40 years wandering, they could have made it in 2 weeks if they'd have just not even walked hard. So they went round and around for 40 years wandering through the desert. Why the journey? It's because teaching doesn't really take if it's given in a vacuum. How many of you remember algebra really well? If somebody confronted me with the most elementary algebra problem, I doubt that I'd be able to sit down and go through it. Right? I mean, it's like this. I remember when Becky and I were living in Pennsylvania, I took a Spanish class. Now, I'd already started studying Spanish on my own, but I thought, you know, there's a free class being offered. I'm going to take it. Free. All I had to do is drive a little bit. So I went to the class, and here I am 25, 30 years hence. Very little of that stuck. And there's a reason for that. It was done in a vacuum. I was not going out every day and rehearsing the Spanish because I didn't have to. Everybody I talked to spoke English. Well, this is why God had the wandering. The teaching had to take place in a context. What was the context? The context was the difficulty of wandering in the desert for 40 years. And so the teaching is taught. If God had shown up on the earth in 1960 in some significant way that everybody thought, wow, there is a God, I bet you by today most people wouldn't remember it. Because all they would have would be the stories that some of us who were there might tell. They wouldn't have the experience. So teaching is important. It needs to happen not in a vacuum, but in a context where the teaching is applied to something. It helps a lot. Another is tempering. And think about, for instance, before we look at tempering, just think about the way we do Sunday school. There's a reason that I don't just get up and lecture for 30 or 40 minutes. Because it's not going to help. But if we're talking about it, arguing, Rip, I don't think you're right about that, or whatever, it sticks. It sticks better if we have that occasion. They were tempered by the trials. I mean, we know this, right? Everybody understands this. Things happen to us that improve us when we have to resist something a little bit, when we have to do a little work to get there. And they walked through some trials. That when they move into the promised land, there are going to be a lot more trials. God's not going to just wipe everybody out from in front of them. It's going to be a gradual process where they clear the land of these people groups that are already there. He's going to help them, but there's still some work to do. So they needed to be tempered. They needed to be readied to face that which they were going to have to face. And then finally, they're remembering. This is huge because for a lot of them, it's not a memory anyhow, other than stories they've been told. And so Moses is trying to get them to the place where they'll see, as they revisit the history from the stories, here's the place where we made a mistake. and don't make that same mistake. I mean, we say it all the time, don't we, that experience is the best teacher, and there's a reason for that. Because you make a mistake, it costs us something. When I make a mistake and have to get in the truck and go back to the lumberyard because I've miscut something, it costs me time, energy, and money to do that. I'm not going to make what I could have made on that job because now I've got to replace something that I've done errantly. So I guess in some way you could say, well, why didn't they just all obey God right from the beginning? Well, first place, we're not really good at that. And the second is, God used every minute of their struggle to teach them, temper them, and help them remember as they come into the promised land. So there's a record here. And this is where God's really smart. He takes human nature as it is, and he works with it as it is. And he does the same thing with us today. So this brings us to the TV screen here, which I'm very pleased with myself today. Has it still got the thing up there, Brad? Excellent. Because I didn't even know I could do this. I didn't know that I could have sermon and a screen that said something else all at the same time. So I'm really happy about this today, because I didn't think it would be good to go through this without something for you all to look at where it would help you perhaps to remember some of this. Moses is teaching here, and God teaching through him, on the basis of what he knows human nature to be. So why is this the way it is? What is he getting at here? Well, let's stop and consider this. This is the way human nature is. I'm saying that just because it looks to me like that's what God is saying. So here's how it works when a group of people pass through stages of living. The first stage we're going to start with is the stage the Jews started with in Egypt, and that is oppression. They're enslaved. They're being ruled without their consent, which for us as Americans is just unheard of, right? We're ruled only by our consent. We'll vote for you. And even if we didn't vote for you, a large number of people did. So as a people, we're only ruled by our consent. They were not. Pharaoh was not somebody that they had voted for, and Pharaoh was oppressing them. They were enslaved. So the people become restless. Their unrest starts to stir. You remember when there came a point at which Pharaoh punished them during the plagues by saying, you're going to have to make the same number of bricks every day, but you get only half the straw. Well, they don't have anything to say about that. They've just got to make it work. And so they become restless. People start, I can imagine, while they're putting those bricks into those forms and trying to get the clay mixed up, they're complaining. I'm sure they're complaining. Doesn't the scripture say it? God heard their groaning while they were in Egypt. So there's unrest. Well, the next stage is you get organized. You find somebody who will lead a revolt, who will help us out of this oppression. And Moses is raised up. He becomes the deliverer. God places him in that position. Then there's civil resistance. That had already started to happen, right? All the way back, Moses is the product of civil resistance. There is no Moses unless there's civil resistance. His mother put him in a basket and put the basket in the river because she did not want to obey Pharaoh's edict to kill the firstborn male child. Right? Moses floats off. Moses comes to be who he is. The reason for that is there was civil resistance. It was already taking place. Then there's just open rebellion. And this is where the population, the Jews, the firstborn die throughout Egypt. The angel of death passes over the Jews' homes, and they leave. We're out of here. And they leave. And then there's revolution. That is where the new nation begins to form itself. You see the Jews becoming a Jewish nation apart from their enslavement in Egypt. And then they come to the promised land and they find themselves free. We're free here. We've come to the land God's giving us. We're going to be a nation. We're free with exception of our rulership by God. We can do what we want. We can occupy this land. We occupy the land. We find ourselves in the land. We find ourselves secure. And the next step in that trajectory is that we become a stable nation. And they did. They became stable. Now, stability is a good thing. You see the trajectory of stability. It was rough. God brought judgment throughout the time of the judges after they had taken the land under Joshua. They continued to do battle with some people groups that God left there just to let them know you need to remember where you came from. But there is this sense of stability, and they say at some point, finally, it comes time for Samuel, the last judge, and they say we need a king, so God gives them Saul, and then there's David, and then there's Solomon, and so forth. And so there's stability. The nation becomes stable. Once a nation becomes stable, if the nation has resources, and they had resources, they become wealthy. They become wealthy. And wealth just builds. You've got the climate for commerce. You've got resources. People can take resources and make things of value. We sell the things of value. An economy builds up that we sell outside our nation. An economy builds up there, and the nation becomes wealthy. Well, as soon as people get wealthy, and they stay wealthy for a generation or two, they become bored. They get bored, looking for something new. Well, when people get bored, usually with human nature the way it is, there is immorality because of a search for novelty. In other words, just living a normal life in a secure marriage, let's say, that's not good enough. Maybe I should look around. Maybe I should sneak about a little bit. Maybe I can charge my neighbor a little bit too much money and get richer myself on their back. Maybe I can do things that make life easier for me while I exploit other people. And that's what happens. That's just human nature. If the opportunities are there because of wealth, then boredom ensues, and now we look for better ways to live that are more suitable for us, even if it means I'm going to exploit somebody else. And that creates moral drift, because the moral compass now, the needle has moved away from straight up. G.K. Chesterton said it well. There are many angles at which one can fall, but only one angle at which one can stand straight. And I think he's exactly right. So moral drift takes place because people want that novelty, and the novelty has to be constantly fed. If you don't think that's true, I grew up with 3 TV stations. And then Mom and Dad got cable and we had 10. I was just overwhelmed. I mean, we had black and white, but we had 10 stations that we could get, and they were clear. You know, you weren't looking through the snow and the lines going everywhere and the vertical thing up and down. No, I could see the Three Stooges every afternoon when I came home from school because we had cable. And that didn't satisfy. Now we've got 500 stations. If you want the big package, you can get 500 stations. Or we've got the internet where we've got endless choices. So this idea of moral drift creates in us a sense of restlessness, which is only fed by novelty. Well, the novelty then becomes license. We figure out ways to tell ourselves it's okay for me to do this and have this. Even if it hurts that person over there, after all, it's up to me. I'm the one who has the need or the want, and if I want the want and it hurts that other person, that's too bad for them. Well, what happens? Entertainment becomes more radical. I mean, when my parents would have thought somebody absolutely insane that they would go someplace and pay somebody to strap rubber bands on their ankles and let them jump off a bridge so that they could be snatched back up by the rubber bands. My parents would have just thought, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard of. Now we think nothing of it. Well, what do we want? The novelty causes people then to want things they can't have. And how do they get them? They steal them. They say, you know what? I don't want to work my whole life just to have a car. I'm going to just go get one. And pretty soon criminality starts to creep into a society, and the society then becomes litigious. That is, I'm going to sue you. I slipped down in your store. You should have had the floor cleaned when I came in. Your sidewalk's got a crack in it. I'm suing you. Or we want protection. How many, did you know, I did not know this, that the legal system in the country right now is 20,000 pages and growing every day. We got 535 people in Washington that we pay full time to sit up there and tinker with the laws. That's all they do. We've got people in our own legislature in Georgia to do the same thing, and every one of the 50 states has the same. How many people are involved right now in just creating more laws for us to live by? Why do we need them? Because we can't trust each other. You want to go into business with somebody, what do? First step, hire a lawyer. Second step, draw up a contract. Third step, sign the contract so that if you renege, the other person's going to get you. It's going to cost you something to step out of that contract, to break your promise. So once the nation gets to that stage, the criminality grows, and then people cry out for security. That's where we are right now in this country. We are crying out for security. Help us. We need laws to protect us from all these renegade people running around who are going to break into our houses. We're having a huge fight in this country, and I'm not saying it's wrong. We're having a huge fight in this country over gun ownership. Why do we need them? They're bad people who come in my house and do something to me. I want a gun in my house, and I don't want anybody to tell me I can't have it. Why is that way? Because there are bad people, right? So we want security. Well, what do we do? Who do you appeal to for security? Who do we appeal to? The government. Come and make the laws. Give us the security. Build the wall. Everything. I'm not saying any of these things are wrong. I'm just saying this is the natural progression for human nature. We need that central, predictable power that we can call on to come and help us out. Because of all the trouble, all the dust. Well, then what happens next? God says, okay, I'll step in. That's exactly what he did with the Jews over and over and over. God stepped in. He said, you've gone way too far here. Your king's not helping you. Your government's not helping you. Your prophets are lying to you. I'm going to step in. And when he does, he brings some kind of judgment. And guess where you wind up? Oppression. Right where you started. All over. And look at the history of the Old Testament and tell me this is not how it goes. It always goes this way. Why does this happen? Why don't we learn? Because we're human beings. We're just wired like this. It's sorry to say, but that's the way it is. I feel it in myself. Do I get up in the morning and go to a job and I get there and maybe it's a little too hot or a little too cold, or I get there and I drop my keys in the mud and I think to myself immediately, the world is fighting me. Like it's something that's alive. It's doing this to me. I'm suffering because the world is fighting me. Why? Because we're trapped in time. We can't escape it. The reason the keys falling on the mud bother me is because that's a robbery from the lifetime I've got left. I got to bend down and get them out of the mud. I've been robbed of a few minutes. Or somebody calls me on the phone who I really don't want to talk to. Customer's got a drip. And I got to spend the day talking to whatever it takes. The reason I feel that way is because I'm having life taken away from me. And I've only got a fixed amount. We're trapped in time. Did you know that from the Exodus to Saul is about 350 years? That's not very long. Look at all that happened in 350 years. We've only been a country, roughly, if you go all the way to the Mayflower, 400. So what are we going to do? Well, it seems to me that God's given us this chunk of flesh between our ears that allows us to think. And it allows us to make a choice to say just what Moses told the Jews to do. Acknowledge God in all your ways. Don't think that you got the wealth because you're so smart. You got the wealth because God gave you a brain and a body that worked and you were able to go get it. That's the only reason. I'll never forget one day, several years back, it's got to be a decade, somebody talked to me about, it was an innocent conversation about what they'd earned. And it was an innocent thing. I remember my grandmother saying things to me like this. You know, if you want to have nice things, if you'll get out and work, you can earn the money and have some nice things. Nothing wrong with that message. But the real message is, how do I get to the place where I can even do that? The only reason I can is because I have a mind and my hands work and my body works and I get up every day and everything works well enough that I can go do that. It doesn't have to. There are people all over who can't do that. They can't make those choices because their body or mind doesn't work like that. Why is that? Because Moses is saying, remember, God gives you that. God gave you that. You didn't get it. The resources that are in the ground, in the land I'm bringing you into, you didn't put them there. The resources in our country that we have, we didn't put them there. God put them there. So we have the choice. And here's how this works. If you go to any church, anywhere, evangelical church, and you ask people, Mr. and Mrs. Lunchbox, could you tell me what's the priority structure in your life? You know what a Christian will always say? God, then family, then marriage, then work. They'll make a list and they'll start with God every time. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. But there is an error in the thinking. You know what that is? Those are little boxes. Every one of those is a little box. God is a box. Family is another one. Marriage is another one. Work is another one. The way the list should go is God in my family, God in my marriage, God in my work. If ever we come to the place where we kick God out as though He's not important to that feature of our living, we've created a place where God doesn't live in us. That was the problem. That's how we talked about it in Sunday school. That's how we can come to the place where we can find ourselves clever enough to rationalize away that which we know in our conscience that God is saying, don't do that. But we figure out a way to do it, and we figure out a way to make it right. The reason is because we've got the little boxes. There is a richness in living that is only going to be found. I wish I could learn this lesson 30 years ago. A richness in living that will only be found when the boxes go away and God is invited into every corner of my living. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me, I'll stay here as long as it takes as we close. It's going to be a soggy walk to the car, isn't it? Hey. Boy, if I had a sermon that was going to run over, today'd be the day to do it, wouldn't it? Keep us in here for another half hour while it quits raining. Hey.